Well, everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and take a look at the iPad 10th generation and compare it against the iPad 5th generation and see which specific model is the better one for you. Now, like I mentioned before, for many years now, the iPad 5 I think is a very interesting iPad, but the iPad 10 is definitely the better one. So if you want to pick up the iPads I would recommend this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there. You can help support the channel at the same time. Now, what's very interesting is that the iPad 5 is pretty much one of the oldest supported iPads right now on iPadOS 16. So this is actually very interesting. If you wanted to go and buy an iPad that's the oldest one that's still supported, the iPad 5 is one of those ones, which is actually pretty insane. So I don't know if this is the exact one you should go and buy, but there was a lot of controversy of this iPad not too long ago because of iPadOS 16. Now the iPad 10 is the latest and greatest in the iPad lineup. They went ahead and shrunk down the bezels, which is nice, but the iPad 5 with its 9.7-inch Retina display is still not that bad. You know, Apple put a really high resolution displays on both these iPads, which is nice. So they've never really skimped out, I would say, on the displays of these iPads. But at this point, you didn't have ProMotion, you don't have True Tone, you don't really have anything crazy, although the iPad 10 doesn't have it either. It's still really nice that this iPad looks the way it does and that it's still supported with software. You know, it definitely has a dated design, thick bezels, you know, Touch ID, you know, within the home button, which is not really the most appealing thing, but still, it's a very good looking iPad for its age, and I don't think it's that bad. On the iPad 10 though, we now have a 10.9-inch liquid Retina display. So this panel also has True Tone within it as well. So no ProMotion in either one, but that is a really cool thing that we have that type of capability. In my opinion, having an iPad like the iPad 10 will pretty much future-proof yourself for a long period of time. So that was something that I really did like about that specific iPad. Now, like I said, it has removed a lot of the bezel, which is nice, so that's a really cool thing. But, you know, there is a very interesting thing on the bottom. So on the bottom of both of them, they both have, you know, their charging ports. With the iPad 5, we have a Lightning port, which is cool, but on the iPad 10, we have a USB-C port. This is a really big upgrade. Now, it's not a Thunderbolt port like we have on the M2 iPad Pro, but it's still a pretty functional machine, and really anything you can do on the Lightning port on the iPad 5, you can do on the iPad 10. Now, the iPad 5 actually did not have Apple Pencil support, so if you wanted to go ahead and actually use, you know, Apple Pencil with that iPad, you couldn't really use that on the iPad 5. But the iPad 10, we do have, you know, Apple Pencil 1 support. Unfortunately, we have to get a dongle to plug it into that USB-C port. So this in and of itself is a really annoying thing. If you're never going to use an Apple Pencil, it's not that big of a deal to you. Personally, I don't even use an Apple Pencil that much, but it's the thought process behind this. Why did Apple just decide to do something like that? Personally, that doesn't make too much sense, and I just kind of wish they didn't do it, to be honest. So as of this point, that's kind of where we're at. You have to buy a dongle if you want to use an Apple Pencil 1 on your iPad 10, but regardless, you still have that capability there. The iPad 5 didn't have it, so keep that in mind. We also have the flat side around the iPad 10, which looks really good. The iPad 5 had that curved side on the back, so not the biggest deal in the world, but it's also something to keep in mind. And on the back, we have this flat side on both. Now, the camera sensors are on the top left on both of them, which is nice. You have the Apple logo in the center, and you have like some certification stuff at the bottom, and that kind of covers it up on the outside. You know, I will definitely say the iPad 10 is definitely the more premium one. It definitely looks far better than the iPad, 5 as well. But I will say the iPad 5 still looks pretty good. Like, it doesn't look that old. It still feels very premium, and I'm still kind of happy with the way it looks. But looks can be deceiving. The camera is a pretty big difference here, if I'm being honest. So on the iPad 5, this camera sensor is pretty much the same thing as an iPhone 6. We had an 8-megapixel wide-angle camera on the back, we had a 1.2-megapixel front-facing camera. On the iPad 10, we now have a 12-megapixel wide camera on the back and a 12-megapixel landscape ultra-wide front camera. So to kind of break it down, the iPad 5 has pretty much the same camera as the iPhone 6, like I mentioned. The iPad 10 has kind of the same camera as the iPhone XR on the back, and it has the same camera as kind of like an iPhone 12 on the front, something along those lines. So that is a really cool thing that you have the capability there. So personally, as I mentioned before, if you have an iPhone 6 or newer, you are going to have a better camera or equal camera on your phone than you would on an iPad 5 in this case, but also with the iPad 10, if you have an iPhone XR or newer, you're going to have a better camera in your pocket than you do on this iPad 10. So keep that in mind. I wouldn't necessarily go from one iPad to the other just because of the camera, but it is one of those things that you can kind of look at and be like, oh, that's really cool that this phone has that type of capability, because it is really nice that tablet has that type of capability. So the camera on the iPad 10 is definitely far better than the iPad 5, but I don't think I would go from the iPad 5 to the iPad 10 just because of the camera. So that kind of covers it up there. Now, in terms of software and longevity, this one is kind of complicated because the iPad 5 is still supported with software, which is very interesting considering it has the same chipset as the iPhone 6s, which is unsupported with software. But the thing to keep in mind here is that in this specific situation, the iPad 10 is definitely going to be the far better and just going to outlast the iPad 5 in pretty much every single way you could possibly think about it. In my opinion, the iPad 5, I think it's probably going to be discontinued if I had to estimate maybe in like the next year or so. Maybe it'll get iPadOS 17, but after that, it's not going to last that much longer. So that is a big, massive thing to keep in mind. In my personal opinion, the iPad 10 is definitely going to outlast the iPad 5, and that is a big thing to keep in mind as well. So in terms of that, that kind of covers it up in this specific standpoint. Now, in the performance segment, this is another really big thing. So with the iPad, 5, we had the Apple A9 chip inside of it, which was pretty much the same exact chipset as the iPhone 6s. On the iPad 10th generation, we have the Apple A14 Bionic chip, which is the same chipset as the iPhone 12. So you are getting a far better chipset on the iPad 10 than on the iPad 5. Now let me break down the performance breakdown for you real quick. So with the iPad 5, it was good when it first came out, but right now it's definitely showing its age. It's definitely an older iPad than a majority of people will probably realize. And because of that chipset, it's only a matter of time before it's discontinued. And if you're a student who's wanting to take notes or whatever, you're probably going to be very, very okay if you were just reading documents, you're maybe highlighting some stuff, and then, you're going through like that. And I don't want to give the impression that this, iPad is unusable. That is not the case, but depending on what you want to do, if you even want to go up a notch a little bit and you want to start maybe like doing some slight video editing, or you want to go ahead and, go on certain applications like Instagram or, Twitter or whatever, even TikTok, and you want to start, kind of branching out of the standard, maybe like reading documents and doing web browsing and that kind of stuff and watching videos, you're going to have a harder time kind of adapting your iPad to that kind of situation because it just isn't the best performing iPad in that standpoint. It's not that optimized anymore. And even with iPadOS 16, that came with tons of features. A lot of those features did not come on the iPad 5, which is probably a better thing because this thing probably wouldn't be able to handle all those features. So that is kind of the problem we're at. With the iPad 10, completely different story. Basically, everything you would ever want to throw in on an iPad, you can definitely do on an iPad 10. In fact, there have been iPads like the iPad Pro that, from the 2020 model that had like technically less performance heavy chipsets than this thing. So this iPad with the A14 Bionic, I will definitely say is totally fine, and pretty much anything you'd ever want to do, you could easily do on this specific iPad. It's definitely not going to be perfect, but I think it's definitely going to get the job done, and it's going to be far better than the iPad 5th generation. Whether you're gaming, you're doing some slight or heavy video editing, you're doing, some other stuff, music producing, whatever you want to do, you can definitely do it on the iPad 10. I love the iPad 5. I think it was a great iPad when it first came out, but I think the iPad 10 is definitely far better. And that kind of encompasses my whole entire thoughts on the iPad 10. I think the iPad 10 is a much better iPad than all the other iPads that came before it from its baseline, the iPad 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. But the problem that we have is that this new generational gap, Apple has kind of forgotten what made iPad so beautiful. They went ahead and they added, the dongle you have to buy now for Apple Pencil support. That's so like Apple, but that's also so unlike Apple in a lot of ways too. On the iPad 10, they also went and increased the price tag to $449. It used to be $329. Now it's $449. That's still a lot of money to spend on this type of iPad. So, in my opinion, the iPad 10 is far better than the iPad 5, but luckily Apple is still selling the iPad 9th generation, which I love, and I think that is a tremendous iPad as well. So, the choice is yours, but I'd probably recommend either buying an iPad 9 or an iPad 10 over the iPad 5 for sure. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.